So when I was working on this project, so we do the fiscal and monetary history of Ecuador from '65. And when I was looking at the data, I looked a lot at the data. What I have done so far is gather a lot of data. And I found two issues that were salient. One is that Ecuador has experienced a very disappointing long-run economic performance. So for the period '65 to 2011, the average growth rate is 4.3%, but only 1.9 in per capita term. And it's very varied. So I'm going to talk about this period later on. This is when Ecuador discovers oil. So you see that, for example, in the earlier period, the per capita growth rate is 0.8, then it's 6.3 when they discover oil, and then it has basically decades of negative average per capita growth. And then in the later years, it resumes growth, but it's not that impressive. The other is, I mean, the region in general, in the 80s, did not perform very well, and in the 70s did not perform very well. So you could say, oh, maybe Ecuador is in line with the region. But even when you compare Ecuador to Latin America, Ecuador lags against the region. Right? There is a discovery of oil when Ecuador kind of catches up with the region, but then it keeps lagging with respect to the region. So Latin America experienced this lost decade in the 80s, the infamous lost decade. But Ecuador piled another lost decade on top of the earlier lost decade. So Ecuador has the 80s as a lost decade, and then it has yet another lost decade during the 80s. Right, so the average growth is -0.2 in the 80s and -0.3 in the 90s. Now, so if you look at the volume that Kehoe and Prescott has about the Great Depressions, they have a definition of a Great Depression. And Ecuador fits very closely the definition of a Great Depression according to Kehoe and Prescott. They look at output per working age person. And their definition of a Great Depression is that it has to be very quick. So in the first 15 years, the trend of GDP has to go down by more than 15%. That is something that we see in Ecuador.
So this is imposing the 2% trend?
The 2% trend, that is the trend that they use to the trend. To the trend every country, not only the US. And then Kehoe and Prescott, they say that after 20 years, the trend of GDP has to go down by 20%, and that's also something that we see in Ecuador. The other criteria for the Great Depression is that GDP cannot grow at trend at any moment during the Great Depression, and Ecuador has only 1 year when it grows above trend. So that's the only condition that does not satisfy for a Great Depression. But other than that, this is like very close to a Great Depression. So that's one, disappointed growth. And the other is persistently high inflation. Until the 70s, inflation was not that much of an issue for Ecuador. It was about 4.8% a year. But since then, inflation jumps and averages about 30%. That for some countries in the region, as people have mentioned, this is good news, right? So some countries had hyperinflation, inflation in the thousands. But in Ecuador, it had like an average 30% inflation, and it kept having inflation while other countries did not have inflation anymore, like during the 90s, like Argentina, and so on and so forth. Right? And inflation only went down in Ecuador, only really went down in Ecuador after after Ecuador dollarized. Ecuador is nowadays an officially dollarized country, the only country probably in the countries that we examine that is officially dollarized. So that's the only moment when inflation goes to one-digit inflation. So a lot of the all of the papers, we look at the budget constraint in the paper of Sargent 83. In that same volume, there is this other chapter, the ends of 4 big inflations. And Sargent looks at what ended inflation in these countries in Central Europe in the 1920s. And he says that what was needed to end the inflation was a major policy change in the regime change. Right, not just like a little change. It has to be something significant. And that's what happened in Austria, Germany, Hungary, and Poland. And that eliminated inflation. And this is something that kind of we see in Ecuador, like the big regime change was Ecuador got rid of the domestic currency, doesn't have monetary independence anymore. And then the inflation is not an issue. Well, inflation, we don't see high inflation in Ecuador, right? So I mean, this is the graph for CPI inflation in Ecuador, right? And this is this is probably a couple, so a lot of people have probably said this, I missed the morning, but we usually, or people tend to attribute poor economic performance and high inflation to bad fiscal and monetary policy, right? What I'm doing at this stage, I have collected a lot of data. I'm going to show you a lot of data. And from just by looking at graphs, we cannot determine causality from looking at graphs. But this is a starting point, and this is a good starting point. In particular, if we all have the same kind of methodology, we can start picking ideas. So looking at looking at the data can motivate our brain if you want. So let me tell you what I'm going to do today. Ecuador is one of these unknown countries. Nobody knows anything about Ecuador. So I'm going to give you a brief review of Ecuador's economic history. This is a very pretentious thing. I'm covering Ecuador's economic history in like less than half an hour, but I mean, I'll tell you what I think is the most important events. Then I'll show you some trends of the data that I have collected. Then I'll show you the budget exercise, and then some ideas for future work. Right? So what I have done is I have divided the analysis in 5 periods. The first period is the period previous to the discovery of oil, then the period of the oil boom, 72 to 81, then the period of the debt crisis, then the 90s, that is the second lost decade, and then from 2000 on, when Ecuador became a dollarized economy. Right? So during the pre-oil period, Ecuador was relatively was an agrarian economy, and what I found a lot in books that I have written, a sleepy economy. That's the way that they describe it, a sleepy economy, dependent on a few agricultural products like banana, coffee, cacao. Right? It was a relatively closed economy, or did not export that much. The export to GDP ratio was about 13%. Was very vulnerable to the changes in the prices of commodities, and the average GDP growth rate was about 4.5%. Right. Things changed a lot when Ecuador discovers oil in the period 72 to 81. So oil is discovered in the Amazon region in Ecuador, and in 72 Ecuador becomes an exporter of oil. And that's when, so you see the GDP of Ecuador is flat, discover oil, and then it's a new level, and it stays kind of like flat during the 80s and the 90s. So we see that's when Ecuador grows a lot. So only in 1 year, in 75, Ecuador grows 25%. This oil boom coincides with a military regime, which, I mean, given the abundance of resources, becomes the leader of the development process, or they appoint themselves the leaders of the development process, and the state becomes a big participant in the economy. For example, what kind of policies they implement? They implement import substitution, a little bit late relative to the rest of the region. In the rest of the region, import substitution was implemented like in the 50s. Ecuador started doing this in the 70s. And this is a period of favorable external conditions, so high oil prices and low interest rates, so it's relatively easy for Ecuador to borrow from the international markets. So this is like the golden years, if you want. And the golden years, they have to end up at some point. For Ecuador, they end up basically in 81. In 81, Ecuador has one of its many wars with Peru. We have another Peru. This is like a recurrent event between the two countries up to a point. So there is this war with Peru in 81, and that's kind of like the bookend of the golden years. This era is also characterized by a decline in oil prices. Interest rates had started rising from before, but they keep going up. So like many countries in the region, Ecuador defaults in 82 on the external debt. And another important event during this period is that as part of a stabilization program, the government depreciates the sucre, the currency at that point, by 32%, and the sucre had been fixed for basically since 1970.
Can you show again the inflation plot? So in the 70s, they had the nominal exchange rate was, but then inflation in the US was also kind of high.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Right. So, so there's this hike in interest rates, and then there's this massive depreciation. So that creates problems for the private businesses that had borrowed from abroad. So the government takes over the debt of the private businesses in Ecuador. So through this mechanism that they call the sucretization, sucretization, where the private firms and banks pay their debts to the central bank in sucres, and the central bank pays the foreign lenders in dollars. So the government takes over the foreign debt of private companies. And then the Ecuadorian economy started being hit by all of these negative shocks. El Niño, it's a big thing in Ecuador. So two big contractions in Ecuador happen when Ecuador experiences a very severe El Niño. One is in 82, 83. So it hurts the primary exports. El Niño passes through the coast of Ecuador, and in the coast is when a lot of the agricultural products are produced, and it destroys infrastructure.
I guess also you have the drop in oil prices.
Yeah. Oh, this period also is a period of oil in oil. Of oil prices, right? So in '87, there's an earthquake in Ecuador that destroys the only pipeline that Ecuador has. It stops oil exports for about half a year. Throughout this period, inflation becomes an issue, about 40% on average, and average GDP growth of 2%. Right? Then this negative decade for Ecuador is followed by yet another negative decade for Ecuador, the 90s, a decade that is characterized by political instability, low growth, and it's bookended by a financial crisis. So the decade ended with relative political tranquility. For the first half of the decade, things were relatively normal, but then things changed significantly in '95. Another event, so Ecuador had defaulted on its debt in the 80s. It finally reaches an agreement in '94 of the Brady Plan. And as I tell you, political instability starts in '95 with so the vice president at that time, Dahic, he was kind of like the engineer. So in the beginning of the 90s, 92 to 96, there is this this administration that was labeled the Orthodox administration, or the neoliberals, how they're usually called. And the engineer of that economic plan is the Vice President Dahic. At some point, Dahic is charged with embezzlement, but he is able to flee. And that starts a period of political instability in Ecuador. Then the next president, Bucaram, he's removed by Congress. Congress declares Bucaram unfit, mentally unfit. All in all, between 10 years, between '97 and 2007, Ecuador has 7 presidents. 5 of them cannot finish their terms. Another bad shock, another war with Peru in '95, and there's another severe El Niño in '97 and '98, and we're going to see that these have noticeable effects on output. What are the other things that happened during this period? One of the interesting things is that in '98, Ecuador drafts a new constitution, and this is for the first time when the central bank is endowed with independence in its history. And we're going to see that this is a very short independence for the central bank, because Ecuador then it dollarizes 2 years later. And then, as I tell you, the period is bookended by a massive financial crisis, a financial crisis that basically claims 50% of the banks. 50% of the banks in Ecuador either have to close or they become state-owned. And in order to provide assistance to these banks, that's when the government has to borrow massively from the central bank to provide assistance to the banks. So during this period of financial instability, there was a lot of mistrust in the financial system. So Ecuador institutes deposit freeze in '99, a corralito. So Ecuador instituted a corralito before the corralito was cool. And then Ecuador also defaults on its so Ecuador reached the Brady Agreement in '94, and it only took Ecuador like 5 years to default on the Brady bonds in '99. So this is kind of like a terrible decade for Ecuador. And then in 2000, so the last period that I cover is 2000 to 2011. This is the period when so in 2000, the Ecuadorian economy, the government officially dollarized the economy. So the currency of Ecuador nowadays is the dollar. So this decision was very controversial at the time, and it was followed by a lot of protests. So the president that dollarized the economy had to leave office because of the protests and so on. But it has proven to be a very popular measure. So nowadays, dollarization in Ecuador is extremely popular. The current president of Ecuador is an economist that one of the chapters in his thesis is how to de-dollarize an economy. He doesn't believe in that, but even he wrote his thesis about how to de-dollarize. He doesn't dare to touch it, at least explicitly. He doesn't like that he doesn't have the exchange rate, but he hasn't de-dollarized the economy yet. Ecuador restructures the defaulted Brady bonds in 2000. As I tell you, this period of political instability in Ecuador ends in 2007 with the new administration by Correa. So Correa has been the president of Ecuador since 2007, so no political instability. We have had the same president for about 8 years. And Correa changes, again, the role of the state, and he increases spending, increases transfer, and this is also aided by, so he's able to increase spending, increase transfers, aided by now historically high prices, and also because the previous administration had built these oil stabilization funds like many other countries have, but he depleted them. So those funds don't exist anymore. He used those funds. Then in the later years of this period, so the international financial crisis hurt the Ecuadorian economy because the prices of oil went down during the Great Recession. And also there was this decline in remittances from Ecuadorians sending dollars back into Ecuador. There is this selective default on the global bonds. So the administration at that time forms a commission to analyze the legality or the legitimacy of the debt. And this commission that is appointed by the administration surprisingly finds out that part of this debt is illegitimate. And the government says this commission has found that the debt is illegitimate, we're not going to pay this debt. So the Ecuador defaults on some of these global bonds. But it was not that Ecuador did not have the money to pay. It was purposely, they didn't pay because it was declared illegitimate. And then later in the year, the government buys these bonds. So Ecuador defaulted on about $3 billion of bonds and then buys these bonds at a 33% haircut rate. All in all, during this period, one of maybe the most interesting point of this period is that dollarization eliminates inflation in Ecuador, at least compared to what we had seen before. So inflation goes from 100% in 2000 to 2.6 in 2004, and it has remained at one-digit levels ever since. So, there has been a spike in inflation, but it has never exceeded 8%. So that's a brief summary of the history of Ecuador. So now, the culmination of this project is to do the budget accounting exercise. So to do the budget accounting exercise, I had to collect a lot of data. And given that I collected a lot of data, maybe I'll show you, because our intention is also to build a common database, so I can tell you the kind of data that I have been able to find. So I show you fiscal trends, and when I talk about the fiscal trends, I'm talking about the central government, and this is the data that I have, data for the central government. So the discovery of oil in Ecuador marks a before and after. So we see that in GDP. GDP is kind of flat, grows because of oil, and the same we see for the government. The government was relatively small prior to the discovery of oil, about 10% of GDP, and then it jumps to be like twice as much. Right? Prior to the discovery of oil, like many developing countries at that stage of development, the main sources of revenues are tariffs and export taxes. And the main expenditures are consumption expenditures and payroll. So and then Ecuador discovers oil, and with the discovery of oil, the size of the government doubles during the oil boom years. And oil becomes a major source of revenue for the Ecuadorian government. About a third of the total revenues come from oil. So I have some data on central government revenues, and we see that oil revenues about a third of total revenue.
So presupuesto you mentioned the war with Peru
Yep.
and the El Nino.
Yep.
So you don't see that much volatility in starting from 80s, right?
From 80. So for example, let me see. So here, this is revenue. So here, you start looking at the decline in revenues because the price of oil starts going down in the early 80s. Then let me remember. There's the war with Peru. Yeah, the war with Peru should be here in 81. There's this. And then there's the other war with Peru in 95. And then you see this spike in expenditures. But yeah. Then, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't look that harsh.
Yeah,
These were not conflicts that lasted.
they were a year. Yeah, no, they were.
They didn't involve major
Reasons.
resources, right?
Yeah, I mean, to call them a war is a little over conflict.
Yeah.
It's over.
For the Peruvian side, it's a conflict, but for Ecuador, it was a big deal. Yeah. Yeah. Now Ecuador and Peru are like they
I don't
dealt
think
with
that
it.
lasting more than a couple of days, really.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
I have a
Each
question.
time.
yeah.
Please, you mentioned that the inflation during the 80s was around 80%, something like this. 40%.
Yep.
So, but this is the balance of the central government.
Yep.
So we don't have any other components of the public expenditures important because what at the end of the day, Pampa believes that the deficit fiscal is one of the most important explanations of the inflation. So I didn't see.
You have interest payments,
Yep.
includes interest payment, all the
Yep.
other guys.
Yeah. So this is the fiscal balance.
Yeah.
Yep.
That means the
So
inflation is not
the
related.
puzzle
to
is
the
why did you have inflation in the end?
So the inflation is disconnected to the fiscal
Yep.
behavior of the government.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is that this is only the central government. So this is not the
Total.
the non-financial private sector, public sector that's.
So you have problems, you have deficit maybe from the central bank, maybe it's for public
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is very important.
yeah.
to discuss
Yeah.
in our
Yeah. I'll try to come back to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this securitization of debt is not included there.
The securitization of debt, you can see it in the debt, in the
Exactly.
stock of debt. Yeah. Yeah, you cannot see it here. Yeah.
But also the other consideration is from those data,
Mhm.
the fiscal policy didn't do anything in any circumstances.
Yeah.
You have a shock, a natural shock, and the fiscal policy
Yeah.
didn't rise.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, so this is the 80s. Revenues declined during the 80s because of a decline in oil prices. Revenues declined significantly in 87, 88 after the earthquake destroys the pipeline. The war with Peru leads to an increase in expenditures in the early 80s, and I'm going to show you a couple more data on that. So then in the early 90s, the early 90s is this period of orthodox or neoliberal policies. So that's when Ecuador runs a surplus during these years. That's when the value-added tax is established in Ecuador, and the value-added tax becomes a preferred way or one of the preferred ways to raise revenues. So the government posts primary surpluses between 92 and 94. The war with Peru reverts this trend. And then after the war with Peru, the late 1990s is a period of low oil prices that drives down revenues. And
In 85, you have an increase in but
in 95,
how much
outlays.
really is?
In 95, you have an increase in outlays.
But that's the
That's the war.
That's the surplus. What you're measuring is the surplus.
This is the balance. Yeah, the surplus. Yeah.
Okay, so then when we look at negatives are actually deficits.
Yeah, negatives are deficit.
So in the 80s, except for 83, these are deficits.
Yeah.
They're not that huge.
No.
It's 4%.
Yeah, but this is
But this
only
is
central
inflation.
government. And this is only central government. So then in the dollarization years, there is on average there's a balanced budget between 2000. So the average balance budget is the average budget is balanced during these years, and then in the late 2000s the revenues increased because of high oil prices and because the administration made an effort to improve tax collection. But so revenues go up, but also expenditures go up. The new administration, as I said, the new administration redefines the role of the state, increasing expenditures. So during the late 2000s, in spite of high oil prices and in spite of the existence of funds in the past, the government runs deficit. So this is an era of bonanza, and even the second oil bonanza, and even with a lot of resources, the government is running deficits. So this is
which one is the period of Korea?
sorry,
When did Korea?
2007 on.
7. No?
Yeah. So I also looked at some data of public debt. So, and what we see is, again, before the oil discovery and after the oil discovery. Before the oil discovery, domestic debt as a percentage of GDP was a larger component of total debt. So external debt was relatively small. And that changes after the discovery of oil. When Ecuador has oil, starts borrowing, it's able to borrow from abroad. So it quickly increases its indebtedness. Then we have the debt crisis period, and the debt to GDP ratio jump. So this is the foreign debt, sorry. The foreign debt to GDP ratio jumps from 25% in 82 to over 70% in 89.
But part of this must be because the real exchange rate is changing.
Partly. And also there is the secretization. There's when the government takes over the private debt. So I think you see here in 83 this increase.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, here you see the secretization when the government takes over.
Yeah, it would be nice to decompose the two things. Like
Yeah,
simulation with a fixed exchange rate. Or something.
Yeah, that's. I think that's something that you didn't do. And another thing that happens is that after the earthquake in 87, the government starts accumulating arrears on interest payments. So this is the path of the total public external debt and the debt including arrears. So arrears became an important component of the total debt.
Yeah.
This
is the gross, without the non-net debt.
This is the yeah. So arrears become huge. Are about at that point are 25% of the total debt. And what we see also is that the composition of the external creditors changes over time. Originally, I mean, when Ecuador was able to borrow from abroad, it was borrowing from private sources. When Ecuador defaults in the 80s, when Ecuador, the debt crisis period, the private component goes down and then the multilateral component goes up, and that's when the IMF and the World Bank start being like the lifeline of the government.
So then at the end in 2009,
there's the selective default. So that's when the government, that's when the government says we're not paying this. Yeah. Then some other facts. The Brady Agreement is reached in '94, and in '95 Ecuador re-enters the international markets. And as I said, Ecuador eventually defaults on the Brady bonds in '99. The end of '98 and '99 is the period of the financial crisis. That's when Ecuador had defaulted on its foreign debt, so it cannot borrow from abroad. It has to supply liquidity to the banks in problems. So what the government does is borrows from the central bank. So domestic debt increases. But this is also a period where the denominator is going down, the GDP is going down. So that's why also those ratios are going up. And then after 2000, so after the dollarization period, in 2000, Ecuador restructures its defaulted debt. And what we have seen is a decline on the two ratios. Because growth has also restarted in the 2000s. So the numerator is growing.
8 million.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yep. So I also have some data on monetary aggregates. So one thing, some of the things that I was looking at is that, so this is the growth rate of monetary aggregates and inflation. One thing that I saw is that in the period previous to the discovery of oil, the average growth rate of the monetary base was in the 2-digit range, but inflation was only 6%. And then after the discovery of oil, the numbers are pretty close, especially after 82. So you see that the growth rate of the money base is 33, and then inflation is 39, then it's 43, and this is very close. So, and the other thing that I'm not the best person to talk about statistical analysis, but one thing that I see is that the correlation between the growth rate of monetary base and inflation increases after 82. So it doubles. Here I think it's like 0.25, and then it becomes 0.5 and 0.6. So there's kind of like a lag. Yeah. I also calculated velocity, and this is another graph. So at some point, the depreciation rate, that became the obsession of policymakers in Ecuador. That was the nominal anchor. So, so one thing that we see, so during this period, the nominal exchange rate was basically fixed. So but then when this fix is let go, we see that the inflation and the depreciation rates move pretty closely. Even though a variety of exchange rate regimes were held at that time. So it was a time where there was the crawling peg, then there was the band, then they let it go. But inflation and then the depreciation rate move pretty closely.
Sorry.
Yep.
Can you go back to this one? After 1999, when the dollarization started, do you have something like that looks like this picture?
Now, after 2000.
After something else.
I could do it, but I didn't know if I should put it, because then the Ecuadorian government doesn't issue money.
But just to see how if there's some type of decouplement.
Probably. I have the data, so that's something I could work on. So then the final point is to do the budget accounting exercise, right? And this is the question that everybody has seen. So I'm not going to talk about that. What we do is we modify this equation to include certain facts that are specific to Ecuador. One is that we don't have data on index debt. We don't have data on this. Even though the Ecuadorian government at some point issued index debt, we don't have data on that. The other, and this is a suggestion from Simon, is that an important source of financing from Ecuador was the deposits that that the government had at the central bank, the use of these deposits that the central government had. So that we include as another source of financing. And then we don't have data on transfers, so we calculate these transfers as a residual like everybody else has done. So then we include these assets that the central government that the government has at the central bank, and then we have a modified budget constraint. So we have the sources on one side and the obligations on the other. Let me tell you a little bit about the data. So most of this data is taken from one single database, and this database is the 85 years of economic history of the Central Bank of Ecuador. So it's pretty consistent. At least I'm taking everything from the same data. This title is misleading, because when I saw this, I said, great, I'm going to be able to do this from the 1930s. But then if I look at the series that I need to conduct the budget accounting exercise, I have all the series starting in 65. So there are some series that start earlier, there are some series that start, the starting point is 65. Now in Ecuador, there is another interesting thing, that is that the budget constraint, this is supposed to be in national currency. And the concept of national currency changes in Ecuador. So up to 99, the national currency is sucre, and from 2000 on, the national currency of Ecuador is the dollar. So what I do is I do the analysis in sucres up to 99, and I do the analysis in dollars in 2000. Because this is the national currency in Ecuador. Now, the other thing is that consistent, because there, yeah.
It's not the only thing you need to define a deflator.
Yeah, but this, before 99, this is measured in sucres. I have data in sucres. That's national currency. And in 2000, national currency is dollars.
Okay,
So,
national account.
yeah, yeah.
But I have a question about
Yeah.
that. The M term actually has a different meaning then.
Sorry, the what?
I mean, in this accounting, the increase in the amount, in the quantity of money in Ecuador is not a senior revenue for the government, right?
So I drop it.
Okay.
I drop it after 2000. So as I said, consistent fiscal statistics for this long period are only available for the central government. There is data for the non-financial public sector that starts only in 2000. I show you some data for 2000.
This is what includes government companies.
This includes government companies, the Social Security Institute, the local governments also.
Includes all
Yeah.
Okay.
Local governments, right? So our notion of the government is the central government. The other thing is that in Ecuador, data on debt is labeled domestic and foreign, probably similar to what is in the data in Colombia, where it's issued. So for me, B is domestic debt and B star is foreign debt. Then the other thing is that foreign debt is the foreign debt statistics that I can access are foreign debt for the whole government, for the non-financial public sector. So there is an inconsistency because on the right-hand side I'm having the central government, and on the left-hand side I'm having the non-financial private sector. But this, I don't have data on foreign debt of the central government. The other thing is that after 2000 I dropped the terms of seniorage and money issuing because this is not the prerogative of Ecuador.
So, if I understand, so why can you do as the consolidated government?
The data that I have is central government. That's
Except for that.
What does it include, central government? Does it include the central bank?
No,
or-
the central government.
No.
It's just the central government. It doesn't include the, yeah, yes, it's the treasury. It doesn't include the central bank. Yep.
But then the data on that includes.
Is for the whole government. Now, you could say, oh, but in the end, this debt, the debt of the local governments, in the end is explicitly or implicitly guaranteed by the central government.
Yes, it's the same situation. In Uruguay, we have the same
Yeah.
situation. We are working to solve that, but it's the same problem.
Yeah,
Because the data is also from the older period for the central government, but not for the total
yeah,
financial sector and non-financial sector.
Sorry about this, but
yeah.
how is organized politically Ecuador?
Ecuador
Is
is,
it federal
no,
state or
it's a bread and
central
butter.
government? That is the main part of the,
Yeah.
of the total government.
Yeah, and then there are provinces, but the provinces, they cannot
Collect taxes.
collect their own taxes, except for cities that property taxes, I think.
Okay, so
Yeah, yeah,
You only have a few minutes.
yeah. So I'm going to finish. So no, there are no data on the nominal rates of return of the debt. So I calculate them as implicit rates. So I take interest effective payments of debt to the stock of debt. And then I can calculate all of the components over time. So these are the sources, these are the obligations, these are the two things together, and these are the averages for the periods. So I can just talk quickly about the components. So one thing, yeah.
Because at the end, there is a sort of monetary base. There are money, the dollars, in the pockets of people in Ecuador that you should be able to measure.
Yeah, it's
There is
measured.
some payment to measure.
No, it's there is a
There's a lot of information that has to do with this M that now you are excluding.
yeah,
It's not
but
serious yet, but it's
there is the measure of money, but this is not the government doesn't pre-issue money, except for coins, and coins are fully backed by reserves, and coins are just a small amount of money, so like it's like fractionary coin.
But you can use the reserves to pay, given that the local
Yeah.
then you can say, okay, give me the money of the central bank and I spend it on highways. You can do. Right? Then some way you can manipulate the monetary basis, that is the amount of dollars in the pocket of people.
Yeah. So that's something we can think about. The reserves that the Central Bank of Ecuador has is what sustains dollarization in some sense. So,
No, it's
yeah.
not to sustain because you don't have a local currency. It's
No.
just to do.
No, but okay, but so I understand is that you have reserves because you have a few coins that you have to, bring a quarter from the US, you just make up
Yep.
Equatorian quarters,
That's why you have the
and then you
deposits
bank
from
those, and then you bank those with reserves.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what the central bank does.
That's-
So there's no senior.
there's
So he's just making zero the term in the budget constraint. It's not saying that the money supply is zero. It's just saying that whatever change is there, it's just accumulated in the central bank at reserves. Every coin it issues has to back it up with the dollar. So there's the net profit of the central bank is zero.
yeah. These coins are tokens.
So even the stock can move. He's not giving any similar. So he's
Yeah.
just making zero the term in the budget constraint.
Yeah. So since I don't have that much time, one thing that I wanted to
Sorry,
Yeah.
but the relation between inflation, you see, you are breaking
Yeah.
an important thing, that the relation between your budget constraint and inflation.
Yes.
Now we are saying inflation here is determined by the amount of dollars that are in the Ecuadorian economy, and that has nothing to do with the budget of the government.
Exactly.
Then who cares about the deficit? If it is true.
Well, no, but yeah.
yeah.
But still the budget constraint has to be satisfied. So
Yeah, right, but what is important for you is to understand the relation between how the budget constraint is affecting the quantity of money
Yeah.
and inflation. Now we are breaking it
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the currency
Yeah.
in your country doesn't depend on
Yeah.
the same way Argentina broke it
Yep.
in the 90s. with
And that's-
convertibility.
And
Even
that's
Ecuador in the 70s, they had a fixed exchange rate throughout the
yeah.
This is the reason why the public debt is very important.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
since you lost that
It's the only
instrument,
tool you have.
you
Yeah.
have to
Yeah, exactly. So in this period, this is zero, right?
Yep.
So these are the only sources, and then the assets that the government has at the central bank, the deposits.
Small point, but you can issue money back in
Yeah.
the interest of the reserve.
Mm.
Do you have interest?
Inter-
You have reserve and you win interest, the central bank.
Yep.
So then you.
The Central Bank of Ecuador earns interest. Yeah.
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 So
It's tiny. It's like
tiny,
yeah.
okay. Because in Argentina
Yeah.
it was not at the beginning of the
Yeah. So one thing so one of the things that we see is that in the sources the role of the domestic versus foreign debt changes with the conditions. So when Ecuador has during the oil period, foreign debt becomes important. Before it was domestic debt. The other thing is that seigniorage is was a reliable source of revenues while Ecuador had it. So here, for example, the needs are 2.8 and seigniorage was a third of that. And then it doubles, right? So it was a reliable source of revenues while the government had it. The other thing that we see is that these transfers are huge. That's the other thing. That's the residual. So I just want to finish. So I just have 1 minute. So yes, I say while Ecuador had monetary independence, seigniorage was a reliable source of revenues. The roles of debt change over time. Transfers are large. Now the question is, what are these transfers? So one thing is to think of these transfers as the deficit of the rest of the government beyond the central government. That'd be one way to think about these transfers. But I extend my analysis for the non-financial public system, and then these transfers, they're still there. It's not that this term goes to zero. So another part of those transfers are what you call the extraordinary transfers. And these are difficult to assess because there's no data on these extra. But what we see, and this I'm going to finish because I'm over, but what we see is that there are these big spikes in transfers, and some of these can be easily matched to when things are going bad in Ecuador. So there is a rapid spike in transfers in '83, and that coincides with securitization. So And there is a rapid increase in transfers in 95, and that coincides with the war in Peru. So maybe there's some military spending that is not recorded, I don't know. So this gives us an idea of what are in those transfers. And I'm going to stop here.
Okay.
Okay, so what they do in the paper, they give a brief outline of the last 50 years in Ecuador, and then they do the accounting exercise that I don't know it now. A lot of it makes a lot more sense after seeing all these chapters because, taking in isolation, it wasn't so clear. Now I see a little bit what, all the chapters are after is a bit identifying the sources of spending and revenues in Latin America. So Ecuador, in a nutshell, from the 70s on, basically mirrors what happened in the rest of Latin America with a few specific features. So in the 70s, they had a boom. In the 80s, it was a bust. In the 90s, they seem to have started okay. It ended up pretty badly. In the 2000s, dollarization, and again, high oil prices. Okay, so in the 70s, what you see is that they found oil, what Julián explained. There was a lot of growth in government revenues and in public spending. A lot of foreign borrowing. So this was an era where a lot of countries were borrowing abroad in dollars, etc., both public and private. Throughout, they maintained a fixed exchange rate, but inflation was actually not that low. So you had all these capital inflows. There was a real appreciation and domestic inflation, even though the real exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate was fixed. Okay? Then the 80s came, the price of oil fell, international interest rates rose, and as in much of the rest of the continent, they had a debt crisis. As in much of the rest of the continent, the private debt was nationalized, so public debt spikes up tremendously. The government is outside of international markets, but you have low growth, high deficits. Since you cannot finance it through debt, you finance it through seigniorage, as in much of the rest of Latin America. Okay? The 90s is a little bit tricky. It seems that they started to do reforms in the early 90s, exchange rate stabilization, some reforms. They undertook some important financial reforms, liberalizing the ability of banks to lend and borrow in dollars, from what I understood in the paper. But then they had multiple shocks besides the political turmoil that Julián explained. You had the tequila crisis, Russia, El Niño, and this ended very badly in a full-scale financial crisis. And once again, there was a surge in public debt because the government stepped in and rescued the financial system. And in the 2000s, well, they dollarized, and now recently they faced again very high oil prices. Okay? So just to have a sense, I'm going to show this picture of all the countries, many of the ones. I just wanted to have a sense of how Ecuador had been doing. So this starts in the 60s up to 2015, and here you'll see a lot of lines. It might not make a lot of sense. That's all South American countries, and the thick red one is Ecuador. Okay, so you see in the 60s there's not much action, and in the 70s actually some countries in Latin America begin to grow, and here you see the boom in Ecuador driven by oil and high oil prices. Okay? Now one interesting thing is when you add the 80s, well, all countries are pretty much flat, except a few exceptions. But the interesting thing about Ecuador is, as Julián explained, that when you extend it into the 90s, it's just flat. It's remarkably flat. So nothing much happened either in the 80s or in the 90s. And this is the crisis I was telling you in 2000 when there was a financial crisis and there was a severe drop in output. And then the 2000s, we see all of Latin America growing, during this period of relatively low interest rates and high commodity. So once again, where is Ecuador? It's exactly in the middle of the pack. You have here, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and Paraguay. These are the countries that have grown the most the last 50 years. And then you have the laggards. Here's Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Ecuador is right up there. Okay. So very good. So what is the question? Basically, the paper gives us an overview of this recent history. Then it tries to address the question of what are the main sources of financing and of fiscal obligations for Ecuador in recent history. We start with the budget constraint that we've seen already, many times today. And then you massage it a little and you reach this equation here. Okay? So that tells us what are the sources of revenue. Well, issue of domestic debt, issue of foreign debt, expansion of the money supply, and seigniorage. These are the sources of income, and expenses are debt payments, both foreign and domestic, plus deficits and transfers. Okay? So Julián explained well, you grab all the data, You look at this equation, you compute the average for different decades, and the main result of the paper is a table like the one you see here that condenses a little bit this information, okay, and tells us for each decade what are the main sources of revenue and what are the main sources of income. So what I want to do is think a little bit about these numbers and see what we can learn at the end of the day from this exercise, what we can take away from it. Okay? So just the first result is exactly what Julián explained in his talk. What appears to be coming out of this is, let's forget a little bit about the obligations and the spending. Where was the government getting revenue? Well, in the 70s, there was domestic inflation, there was seniorage, and there was also foreign borrowing. In the 80s, there was seniorage, and somewhat surprisingly, given that the government supposedly could not access international markets, there is also external debt. This is something I'm going to come back to. And then in the 90s, there's still some seniorage, but now domestic debt plays a role, so there's a shift towards domestic financing. And then we have the 2000s, where here seniorage, of course, doesn't play any role. And actually, there's a lot of minuses here. We're going to talk about that in a while. Okay, but the overarching picture, I think, is in the 70s, they borrowed from abroad. In the 80s, they couldn't, so there was inflation. And in the 90s, there was inflation, and they borrowed domestically. Then they dollarized. Okay? So what are my comments? I have just a few comments. But the first one, and this goes back to what Fernando also said, is just clarifying. What exactly are we looking at when we look at this budget constraint? Okay, you said it was the central government. Now, when I read it, it's not obvious to me whether it includes the central bank, it's consolidated, or central means you don't include provinces, etc. So this needs to be very clear. In my mind, and I'm open to discussion, this only makes sense if we're thinking of the consolidated public sector. Okay, because basically what we're saying is the public sector as a whole needs to spend these things here, let's say, the government plus the central bank, and we can finance it either by issuing debt vis-a-vis the rest of the economy or by printing money. So then it makes perfect sense. Now, if we're looking only at the public administration, at the government per se, without taking into account the central bank, then I'm not sure what this budget constraint is. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because from the perspective of the central government, if I'm just looking at his budget constraint, well, I'm always financing with debt. Even if I give it to the central bank, and the central bank gives me money to pay the expenses, from my perspective, it's debt. When I consolidate it as a whole, then we're financing through seniorage. So this needs to be, better discussed. For me, as a first-time reader, it wasn't at all obvious. I spent time thinking about it, and I think it only makes sense, in fact, to do it if you have the consolidated. Now, you say you don't have it, but at the end of the day, the debt data that you have is consolidated, if I understood correctly. So if that's true, I think what you're doing is okay. But this is just a general comment. Now, the other thing that wasn't at all sure is where these transfers come from. Were they data or are they a residual? Now, of course, since everything ends up looking so neat, suspected it must be a residual, but I didn't know. But then it's a little bit troubling because it's the largest component by far. And so we wonder, okay, what's in there? This is like when we do growth accounting and we say, well, 70% of growth is that A. Okay, what the hell is that? I don't know. Okay, so just to give you a point, look at these numbers. I mean, you have 0.5, 1.6, some 2s. And then when you look at expenses, transfers are 3.5, 5, 4, 8. I mean, these are huge. They're, much larger than anything else in this table. So in order for the exercise ultimately to be informative, I think there needs to be some more detailed discussion, which you do in the paper on some instances, and I'll come back to that. But without understanding exactly what's in these numbers, it's not obvious to me. It's incomplete. And I think it's very important to understand what's in there, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing is how are defaults computed? And this might apply also to other countries. Okay, because here we have debt payments, but in the case of Ecuador, there's 3 defaults in the sample. They default in the 80s, and they're basically in default up to 94 when they do the Brady restructuring. So there's arrears accumulating, which Julián mentioned. They default again in 99, and they default again in 2009. So what's happening here? Here we need to make 2 decisions, or explain them at least. Some of these came up in earlier discussions. The first one is, while I'm in default, what's happening here? I'm not making payments, but payments are actually accruing. So what's happening? How does this enter the accounting? So my suspicion is that what you do is you compute these payments that are due as payments that are made, and you just add them up on the debt on the other side. Okay? Yeah, okay. So when you look, for instance, in the 80s, when the government supposedly did not have access to finance, we see that actually, sorry, here it is, external debt appears here as providing a big source of income. Hey, but the government wasn't accessing. What's happening? Well, what's happening here is simply that debt is accumulating. Why? Because interest is accumulating, but it's a bit fictitious, so this should be discussed.
It could also borrow from the IMF.
Yes, but, you know, at least to understand how this defaulted debt and arrears payments are showing up here, I think is important. And the third thing is, sorry, the renegotiation, okay? So when you reduce outstanding debt, it might show like a big change in debt with transfers on the other side, because apparently we don't know where to put that, but maybe in NPV, nothing much changed. We knew that debt, you know, maybe was at market value, and then we just changed them for new bonds, and this looks like a big accounting operation, but in practice it had very little meaning. So I think we should look a bit closer at this. And finally, when we think about domestic debt, one interesting thing about domestic debt is that when you look at the returns, they're consistently negative and quite negative. Okay? So one thing that I think is going on here is, for instance, look at the 90s. Domestic debt is providing a big chunk of finance to the government, but payments on this debt are actually very small. So a big chunk of them must be getting inflated away. Okay? So one interesting thing that is not discussed here is, in the period when you resort to domestic debt, does some form of financial repression play a role? And I think that's very interesting to discuss in light of also discussions now in Europe. You know, was the government forcing agents to take this debt? What was the regulation on it? Who was buying them, etc. Okay, so these are just some general comments. When you look at this table and you want to understand these numbers, I think these are three things that would be interesting to discuss. Okay. The second comment is, what is the bottom line? Look, when you look at the primary deficit of Ecuador, Ecuador is like a fiscal paradise. I mean, they're incredibly conservative. You had deficits in the 60s and the 70s, but this is nothing, 0.5, 0.75, and then primary surpluses. Okay? So we're talking about a government issuing foreign debt, you know, using seniorage, but to fund what? Well, the answer is these transfers, which are a big chunk of, you know, the expenses, the residual. So we need to understand what's going on if we want to understand the fiscal behavior. Okay? Now, two periods where it's very apparent what is going on is the ones that Julián mentioned. Two big surges of public debt, and where they show up as transfers is during the financial crisis of the early 80s and of the late 90s, when the government basically stepped in and rescued the financial system. Okay? So one thing that I take away from this is that this is not a story of crazy public spending, crazy politicians going amok, okay? But this is a story of contingent liabilities, of a country that was growing a lot, the private sector was borrowing a lot in dollars, both in the 90s and in the 70s, and when the crash came, the government stepped in, you know, assumed all these losses and issued a lot of debt to pay for them. Okay? So I think this is interesting because if we want to understand, you know, why did Latin America pile this debt? Did it come from irresponsible fiscal policies, or does it come because there were contingent liabilities that surfaced and we had to assume them? And you know, there's some parallelism here to the recent European experience of some countries like Ireland and Spain that also didn't seem to be running large deficits, but when the crisis came, they had to step in. Okay? And then just to conclude, actually here you see it, he showed exactly the same picture. The two big increases in public debt are when the crisis comes and it coincides with the government nationalizing part of the debt. So Juan asked you to do the exercise of seeing how much of this is explained by the change in the real exchange rate. I would ask you to do the other part, which is to compute how much of this increase was to actually to the rescue. And that would be very interesting for me as a reader to know. And just to conclude, dollarization. The most interesting thing for me about Ecuador is that we've been discussing dollarization forever in Latin America. Well, here's a country that did it. You know, it's not a small island with 3 people. It's a real country, a real economy. What happened? So this might be a bit out of the direct focus of the chapter, but I think it would be very interesting to have a bit more of an overview of what happened to Ecuador after dollarizing. So you focus very much on the fiscal and monetary side, but I would like to know, what happened to growth, for instance, of the non-oil sector. This is a country that, huge oil windfalls, dollarized. I mean, is unemployment high? Have they lost a lot of competitiveness? All these things we fear about dollarization, did they materialize? At least some discussion of this, I think, would be important. And then some discussion about whether there was at least an attempt. What was their relative performance during the financial turmoil? Did dollarization help them? Maybe dollarization had the cost we thought it would have, but it also had the benefits we think it will have. How did that play out? A brief discussion of this would be nice. And then to conclude, it's true that there's no seniorage maybe, but was there an attempt to conduct some type of monetary policy through maybe capital controls or reserve requirements and so on? It would be interesting to see. So overall, very interesting. These are just some suggestions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.